Welcome to week 2 of musical Herstory. I am really excited about this today. Gotta find my notes now. So for those of you who weren't with us here last time, my name is Kendra Harder. Helping me on the tech side of things is Matthew Praxis. Everyone give a big hand for Matt. Yay! We are streaming from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and we would like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional territory of the Cree peoples and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We pay our respect to the Cree and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. So in today's class, we are going to talk about two amazing women. And if anybody knows like any female composers, if they don't know of too many, it is likely these two. And they are Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel and Clara Schumann. And with these women, as much as they are, maybe the most well-known female composers, how much do any of us really know about them? And how much of their music do we actually know? So I'm really excited to dive into those women. But before we get into their stories, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of the music education for women. In the previous class, I had mentioned one scholar's list of what they called a proper climate for a composer. And the first tier was, in fact, education. So in the early centuries, there were sacred singing schools, but this was mostly male singers and those of the priesthood. In the convents, women were singing, but there's not any record of any sort of formal training or music education. I'm going to jump way ahead into the 15th and 16th centuries, and music education starts to be offered through cathedral schools or apprenticeships with master players. But again, this was closed to women. However, at this point, we start to see how much class was a large factor in access to education or even music in general. Daughters in noble families were frequently provided with private music teachers, and some noble women even went on to become very important patrons of music, which is very important because that kind of funds music and helps it continue to get created. And this is kind of this weird sort of, I don't know, a catch or something. So all of these people in these upper class families, they have all of this amazing access to education, but neither women nor men of upper class families became professional musicians as a rule. So it's like you have this education, but you can't be a composer, you can't be a musician. And that actually, it still continues on once we get into the 19th century too. In the 17th century, we get something kind of rather special in Italy, and that's the Ospedali, which was this religious-based charitable institution that housed and took care of and educated sick, homeless, orphans. The most well-known would be La Pieta, where Antonio Vivaldi would have worked, and he trained all those young orphan girls, and we know that amazing music came out of these establishments. And the Ospedali were a major venue for musical training, and they were really well known for the quality of music and music education. So for those who lived there, they got training in the fundamentals of music. They got sight singing, ear training, performance practice, and training on at least 2 instruments. And that is sort of the equivalent of what we see in our universities in the undergrad in about the first 2 years or so. So that's actually something really special what these Ospedali had offered to these, underprivileged people. It's wonderful. But inside of that, though, it was rather insular, because when a student completed the training, they were then required to remain inside of the Ospedali and then instruct the younger students. Women were, this is actually kind of neat. The Ospedali also offered a dowry for women. So they were able to leave the Ospedali to marry if they had the permission of the governor. And yeah, then they have this dowry. So that's pretty, that's very generous. But then if they didn't marry, they could remain as a permanent resident, and possibly even teach some music outside of the establishment. And yeah, they definitely were able to retire there. So because of the good reputation of this ospedale, there was a demand for opening admission to girls from other backgrounds. So they were able to get in through admission, or audition, beg pardon, but they weren't actually required to join the religious order. So I just thought it was such a neat thing. So I just had to bring that one up. Otherwise, though, music and music education was mostly concentrated in the noble courts, in the church, and inside of the families. So in the 18th century, really the only way a woman was going to get music education was through private teaching. Very few women were given professional singing training, despite the growth of opera at the time. But the scarcity was based on the social view that women could not perform in public. It was very improper. It might even like endanger their morality or their character. Not quite sure how that adds up, but that's what they believed anyway. They also said it was considered unnecessary and even dangerous for a woman to acquire knowledge, as it would detract from their true calling of wife and mother. Here I'm going to read you a lovely quote from Jean-Jacques Rousseau from 1762. "The education of women should always be relative to men, to please, to be useful to us, to make us love and esteem them, to educate us when young, and to take care of us when grown up, to advise, to console, to render our lives agreeable. These are the duty of women at all times, and what they should be taught in their infancy." See my face. This is how I feel about that. Anyway, but despite these attitudes, women continued to learn music privately, and they had increasing activity in the bourgeois music making scene. And this in turn, created more waves. And so by the end of the 18th century, many writers, including women, were beginning to advocate for their rights to education. And so come the 19th century, we start to see a little bit more. And one development that greatly contributed to the eventual rise in women's education was the establishment of public secular conservatories in Europe and North America. And some of these conservatories even admitted women. So they were wanting to offer women a chance to develop music skills that were comparable to those of their male contemporaries, but they were sort of stuck in segregated classes. There were some traditionalists that worried that sex-integrated education would dilute the seriousness of the professional study. Now, I'm going to give you a little stat here and try to keep it in your memory, particularly for when we get on a little bit later in the class. So Felix Mendelssohn founded the Leipzig Conservatory in 1843. His goal was to balance practical musicianship with theoretical training in harmony, counterpoint, and history. And he had this innovative idea of equal opportunities for women. But still women, still separate, still can't have them in the men's classes, but still getting them those opportunities. So please keep that little nugget there in your mind. In the first 50 years of the Leipzig Conservatory, 45.7% of students were women, but they were initially forbidden from studying composition and orchestration. So they would get like your theory, they would get your musicianship skills, that sort of thing, but not composition, not orchestration. Even in 1860, there was an English singer and composer named Clara Rogers who was refused permission to study composition in Leipzig. However, this was loosened, and by 1877, Ethel Smith was allowed to study composition. And we'll get to that next week because she dropped out. She didn't like them. Anyway, next week. So throughout the 19th century, women's careers and achievements increased as they were given more education. Shocking, right? But there were still many pervasive negative attitudes towards women. Most 19th century critics said that women were incapable of the abstract thought that was necessary to construct a large-scale composition. But they did accept if women wrote songs and short piano works, which they often referred to as feminine works. So this is where I'm going to do a very rough tangent into talking about Lieder, which is songs or German songs, sort of the, I guess, predecessor of our pop songs, our folk songs, that kind of thing. So because women's horizons and accomplishments were confined to the home, there was only so much that they could actually write, because you just have like your piano or your lute. And so in the 18th and 19th centuries, we start to see this great wealth of Lieder that is being produced. But reviewers usually called it sort of, they would isolate it as these female pieces, which implied this inferior or even amateur class of musical works. So first, rude. But second, let's look at why some of these compositions may have been considered amateur. So as singing gradually became a part of women's education, and they would be writing Lieder and some songs, they didn't necessarily always receive much more musical instruction than that. Some families from more moderate means were provided with some private music teachers, but then what they were trained on varied greatly from person to person. So one person might get education in piano and singing, then somebody else might get some theory and some singing, or then maybe some composition, some theory, and some singing. There was even one composer who had a very unique, I guess, theory method that their uncle had come up with. So like nobody else really had this, so just something very niche. And this is very pointed and kind of to the point then, and sort of sums up this little bit here. In an obituary of a composer named Corona Schroter, it was recognized that she had too little proper training in composition, and this is why she couldn't put down on paper the music that was inside of her. So I would also like to point out that the fact then that all of this Lieder, and it's good Lieder, it's not bad, it's good, is all the more remarkable because they didn't have the educations of the Schuberts, of the Haydns, of the Mozarts, and they were writing beautiful music. So hands off to all of our, the women from those centuries. Now, not every woman was in such an educationally starved position, and some had very high levels of education. But as I mentioned a little bit earlier, they just weren't in that position, to create music, to have a career as a composer. And one of these such women was Fanny Mendelssohn. And she actually wrote about 200 Lieder, like 200 Lieder. And so the reason I'm really wanting to bring up Lieder today is because since it is often downgraded as this inferior art form, I wanted to just listen to some and just see how much it's not. It's actually a huge part of the music education system. You know, when I was in university, like every voice major, of course, is doing tons of Lieder and of art song. And actually one in particular, there was, it was Stanchen by Franz Schubert. I heard that song probably 5-6 times in my entire time when I was in university, and it wasn't always voice. There was 2 students who played the Casper Mertz transcription on their guitars. And then this isn't the same song, but another piece by Schubert was performed by somebody in a piano quintet. It was really good. He did the trout. So like, it's very much ingrained in our education system, and it's beautiful. So to start off, we are going to listen to Warum sind denn die Rosen so blass? My German is great. So this is by Fanny Hensel. I just got to remember how to share all of this. And I'm going to also put up the English translation of the libretto and the score so that you're able to sort of follow along with either, whichever you would prefer. All right, so here it is. All right. So I just love this. I'm not going to get too theoretical on everyone, but there is this really good analytical article that was written by a musicologist named Stephen Rogers. And when he was talking about Fanny's lieder, he notes how she has this harmonic schemata that is really unique to herself. And what I mean by that is like a collection of chords that sort of create the structure of the piece. But like every single one was just like a little bit different. So like she'd have this structure, but then how she got to each chord would change with each song. And what he found was that the harmonic turns that she would create were prompted by the text rather than by a preconceived musical model. So it was almost as if every poem kind of created a new piece of or a new musical model. Like it's just gorgeous. So anyway, let us now talk about Fanny Cecilia Mendelssohn. She was born on November 14th, 1805 in Hamburg to a prominent family, the Mendelssohns. Her father was Abraham Mendelssohn and her mother, Leah Solomon. And I love this. When Leah gave birth to Fanny, the first thing she thought was to look at the baby's fingers. And she just exclaimed, "Ach, Bach's Fugenfinger." And I just love the Germans. It means fingers suitable for playing Bach fugues. Like, of course they have a word for that. Like, brilliant. So Fanny was the eldest of 4 different children. Her younger brothers were the Felix Mendelssohn, Rebecca, and Paul. All of the children were given excellent education, excellent music education. They were trained with languages, math, science, drawing, etc. And so their mother was a pianist, clearly, since she was excited about the Bach's Fugenfinger, and she very frequently played Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. And she taught Fanny and Felix piano at a young age, beginning with about 5 minutes every day. And then once they were willing and had the concentration span, she extended their practice. Okay, so I have this really good side story I need to tell you guys. I read it and I died. So in like early 1800s, this is, after Napoleon has done the takeover. So in 1806, he imposed a blockade forbidding the importation of manufactured goods and commodities that Europe needed, such as sugar, coffee, cottons. Not really sure why. He also forbade exportation of goods. So as a result, Hamburg became the center of a vast smuggling network. And the Mendelssohn brothers, Abraham and Joseph, were involved and greatly benefited from this little network. But then in 1812, it turned out they had been discovered. So Abraham and Joseph disguised themselves and they fled in the night. So like you can just see it, like these wealthy bankers with their children in tow. Like Fanny is 6 years old, Felix is 3, Rebecca's just like a few months old, and they're running. And so then they went back to Berlin. Anyway, back to Fanny. So Fanny and Felix, and I'm talking about them sort of as a pair because they were very integral to each other's musical life. And so they had almost identical musical education as children. They were taught piano by Mélie Bigot, who was a French pianist who, on doing a reading of Beethoven's Appassionata, really impressed him that he later gave her the manuscript. And she taught them. And then they were also taught composition by Carl Friedrich Zelter. And in 1820, Zelter brought them into his Sing Academy, which, as I understand it, was kind of it was a choir for both adult men and women, and it was sort of quite distinguishing, or that's a word, but it was an honor. It was definitely an honor to bring those two into the Singing Academy. Now, where there are some differences is Felix was given violin lessons, which would not have been okay for Fanny to play a violin, because that's not a proper lady's instrument. And then Fanny was given instruction on how to run a household and how to embroider and how to sew. And Felix was not given that. Like, come on. But as the older sibling, Fanny was very happy to share her knowledge with Felix. And so he grew up accustomed to showing her his work and getting her help and getting her approval. And in time, Fanny would actually do the same. And so both children actively composed, and they were their pieces were often played in their families' Sunday musical gatherings, the Sonntagmusiken. And in 1831, Fanny actually takes these over and has her own very distinguished concerts, private ones, of course. They often composed like for special occasions. Felix even wrote Fanny like a special song on her birthday almost every year. And so by the age of 13, though, Fanny was kind of being seen as the child prodigy. She was an amazing, amazing pianist. A letter from their Aunt Dorothea said that Fanny had this virtuosity that defeated all understanding. And so for her father's birthday, Fanny one year, or when she was 13, not 1 year, when she was 13, she played for him by memory the 24 preludes from Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. So she's amazing. She's amazing. And so now it's going to get a little bit sad and sobering. I apologize. This is a beautiful little quote that I read. So as a child prodigy, Fanny grew up with the illusion that she was accomplishing something. She believed it really mattered to her family if she developed her talent to its full potential. So then around 18, 19, and 20, Abraham then set to trimming Fanny's wings. Her music teacher Zelter also thought it was a good time to rein in her enthusiasm. And so for Abraham, there was no question of Fanny ever having a profession. She wouldn't. She was a woman, and that was her destiny. And so I'm just going to read this letter that he wrote to Fanny when he was away. So perhaps music will be his profession, as in Felix, whereas for you it can and must be but an ornament and never the root of your existence and activity. That is why ambition and the desire to make the most of himself in circumstances he deems important are forgivable in Felix, for he experiences it as a vocation. It is, however, no less to your credit that you have always shown your good heart and good sense at such moments, and the joy you manifest when Felix wins applause proves that you would have deserved it equally had you been in his place. Persevere in these feelings and this attitude, for they are feminine, and femininity alone is becoming in a woman. So it's heartbreaking. Like she could have done so much more. But because of their place in society as an upper class family, it wasn't going to happen. But also kind of just to go a little bit, not in Abraham's defense, but just to add a little bit more understanding to what he would have been feeling, was he would have been really concerned about having the family fit in. Pardon me. In 1816, the family converted from Judaism to Lutheranism. And at the time, in Berlin, like Jewish people were really restricted in where they lived, where they could work, what kind of work that they could have. And so it also came out that their teacher Zelter was anti-Semitic. So there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the society, and I think Abraham really wanted to protect Fanny from that. So by converting to Judaism, which actually lots of other families did, like Jewish families, I should say. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. But by doing the conversion to Lutheranism and trying to seem as accommodating to the societal expectations, I think he was hoping it would just protect his family just a little bit more. So, age 16. Fanny meets the painter Wilhelm Hensel, and they fell in love and they wanted to marry. And then the parents stepped in. And Leah said Fanny was she was too young, it was not time, and she asked Hensel not to press on the point. So then Wilhelm went to Rome for 5 years, and he was, forbidden to write her. So he listened, and instead he sent sketches. And Fanny wrote lots of music. She wrote lots of lieder. And actually in 1 year, she wrote 32 lieder and some of her more ambitious piano works. So despite being apart, they still found a way to self-express and, find their way to each other through their arts. So once they were engaged, so there's this little moment that happens just a little bit before they're engaged, and Wilhelm became a little bit jealous of this poet that Fanny had been setting his poems to music. And so when they were engaged, Fanny was like trying to appease Wilhelm, and she said, "Oh, I'll stop writing lieder. I'll even stop composing altogether. After all, music was only fit for girls, not married women." But here we stand, Wilhelm. He said that Fanny's unlimited practice of music must remain fundamental to their relationship. In 1828, he gave her this gift of a heart-shaped book, and he wanted her to be able to write down her music in there, and then he would draw little sketches to accompany the music. So then they married eventually in 1829, and Fanny actually wrote the organ music for her wedding, and I believe the epilogue was written like the night before. I can't imagine doing that. But Wilhelm was incredibly encouraging. He encouraged her to write. He even urged her on to publish, which her family actually did not do. Yeah, we're running out of time. Just got to skip ahead a bit here. So even though Fanny and Felix had this very mutually supportive relationship with each other musically, for some reason, Felix was like, "No, you cannot publish. I do not support this." Yet, as we heard earlier, he did set up a school for other women to learn about music. There was a composer named Josephine Lang who he really encouraged and helped her find a publisher. And he famously supported Clara Schumann. So, it's this weird dichotomy. It's not just because Fanny is a woman. I don't totally understand it. I mean, I guess it's because she's family, but did not encourage her to publish. And so it's actually not until about a year before Fanny dies that she actually gains the courage to publish her music without Felix's approval, which was very important to her. And so this is kind of preceded by this trip that the Hensels took to Italy. And it was a trip that Fanny had been dreaming about all of her life. And so while she was there, she was really inspired, and she had a lot of creative output. And one of the pieces I put in the playlist was written around that time. It's called Das Jahr, and it's a piano piece and it's music for each of the 12 months. It is gorgeous. I highly recommend listening to it. It's amazing. If I didn't want to talk about lieder so much, I would have talked about this piece. And so when she wrote it, she wrote it into another one of these notebooks. And then once again, Hensel did some paintings and some drawings to accompany the music. So in 1846, Fanny finally publishes her first collection of lieder. And the more that her work was published, she experienced more bursts of confidence and optimism. And after a second trip to Italy, she starts composing more complex music, including some chamber music. Her composing seemed to be taking on this new sophistication, and a real career as a composer seemed possible. But then the really sad thing is that the next year, she died suddenly of a stroke, and she was only 42 years old. So it's just devastating, because she's finally getting where, she's finally taking those steps. She's finally doing the things she wants to, and unfortunately she passes away. So Felix was devastated, and in his grief, he really wanted to publish more of her works posthumously, but then he died within 6 months of Fanny, and then the vast majority of her works were actually left unpublished, which is really too bad. ooh, we are really running low on time, but we have to listen to Nacht Wanderer, so we're going to. Also, this singer is so good. I don't even know her name because the writing is all in Japanese, and so I have no idea what her, I think it's Akiko, but I don't know her last name. Anyway, beautiful voice. So we just need to play this song. Okay, here we go. I do have to pause it because I have so much to talk about with Clara. Yeah. Okay. So we are now going to move on, but please listen to those recordings. I also have recordings by a couple other singers on there because with Lieder, it's so hard to know who to pick. They're all beautiful singers. So Clara Schumann. She is kind of a big deal. In 1837 and 38 in Vienna, she is pretty much the Beatles. Hear me out. So her concerts, all of them, they sold out. The Viennese were storming the box office. There was even a report that the police had to be called in to restore order. The mobility were all just vying to have her come and play private concerts in their palaces. And she even had a dessert dedicated to her, Torte à la Vique. A critic writes, in her creative hands, the most ordinary passage, the most routine motive acquires a significant meaning, a color which only those with the most consummate artistry are able to give. On March 15th, 1838, she is bestowed the Königlich und Kaiserlich Kammervirtuosin, which is the Royal and Imperial Chamber Virtuoso. Nobody who has been aged 18, foreign, Protestant, or female had yet been given this honor. The Viennese publishers were requesting new music for publication. Anything from the pen of Clara Wieck was sure to sell. So to this request, her father Friedrich said she only had 2 hours in a day that she could compose, between 9 and 11 p.m. All the other time was committed. Of this amazing Beatles-like Viennese trip, Friedrich was thrilled with the success. It was his artistic and financial triumph. Yeah. But Vienna was not Clara's first trip to the races. Oh no. She had already been playing concerts for 10 years. She had played Leipzig, Dresden, and Paris. And over her lifetime, it's like whole life, she played over 1,300 public programs in England and Europe. She was one of the first pianists to play many of Beethoven's sonatas publicly. She premiered works by Chopin, Schumann, Robert, well, I guess, and Clara, and Brahms. And she also reintroduced audiences to Bach and Scarlatti, whose music was no longer performed frequently. Her programming and musical standards changed the character of solo piano recital in the 19th century. So she is iconic. Her last public performance was in 1891, where she played Brahms' variation on a theme of Haydn for 2 pianos, with a colleague, obviously. She's not that amazing. She doesn't have 4 hands. And in 1878, she became the permanent faculty member at Hoch Conservatory in Frankfurt. And this is great. So this is a student. So she is very well known. Like everybody wants to study with Clara. Listen to this. One English pupil notes in his diary, "At home, I was overwhelmed with congratulations. It is done. I finally made it. Hurrah! Long live 7 hours of daily practice." A few days later, he wrote, "I am proud to be a Schumann scholar now. I never would have dreamed how difficult it would be to get accepted to her class. Everyone in my generation is trying for it. I believe that fortune really favored me, but I certainly also worked hard enough to earn it." So she is an amazing pianist. I also have in the videos, this is a really cool find. It's a video interview with one of her students, and not video, it'd be a gramophone. Interview with one of her students. So then we actually get to hear about Clara's teaching. So I really encourage you all to go in and listen to that. So in addition to being an amazing performer, Clara was also a great composer. She really believed it about herself, but she really was. She published her first piece at age 11. And so before we get into her story, because there's so much and I'm going to run out of time, so I don't want us to not listen to something by Clara before we finish today. So I am going to play for you the piano concerto in A minor, and we're going to start in the second movement at the romanza. Start share. And oh, I just love this piece. All right. Oh, great. Here we go. I'm actually just gonna, so sorry, but I'm just gonna skip ahead here. There's this beautiful moment where the cello comes in on these really just low notes, and just like listen really carefully. It's so faint and it's so perfect. There's just this little tiny accent of a timpani roll, and it's just so quiet. It's just so perfect. And there's this like contrasting pulling because the cello is down in its low range, but then she's kind of climbing the piano up gently. Then we get this low roll, and then it kind of rolls us into the next movement. Okay, here we go. Listen for this. And then it just goes to the next movement. Ah, it's amazing. Okay. Yeah, so there's a recording there on YouTube. I just preferred my CD recording. Okay, so there is so much to talk about with Clara because she has an amazing career, but she actually had a very unique life and a very unique situation. And even though we see this amazing life and we think she must have had an amazing life, she had a really hard life. You might have noticed some little things about her father I highlighted when we talked about her Beatles days. So, so Clara was born September 13th of 1819 to Frederick Wieck. He owned a piano business, selling, renting, and repairing pianos. And in 1815, he started teaching piano. And he had an extraordinary gift for pedagogy and understanding the learning process. Like legitimately, like Clara is an amazing pianist because of him. And then her mother was Marianne Tromlitz. She sang and she played piano very well. She performed at the esteemed Gewandhaus. And so as time moves on, Friedrich acquired this excellent reputation as a piano teacher, but this was partly because of his wife's performance. So in 1824, Marianne left Friedrich and she took Clara with her, and Clara was 4 at the time. But Friedrich was determined that Clara would be a virtuoso pianist, touring and promoting his teaching and his pianos. He was not going to let Clara slip through his fingers. And so by law, the eldest 3 children were the property of the father. So Mariana was permitted to keep Clara until 4 days after her 5th birthday. After that, once the divorce was granted, Mariana could now only see the children at Friedrich's pleasure. And I'm sure we can imagine how often that was. So Clara did not really have a childhood. Her life was lessons and it was practicing. But as I've mentioned, Friedrich was a great teacher. He taught Clara to improvise before he taught her to read music. She knew cadences in all keys. So cadences are those last 2 notes that end our usual phrases like that, ba, ba. And she could transpose simple melodies. He taught her the art of singing so that she would learn the finest touch on the piano. And by age 9, he started her on formal lessons in theory, harmony, counterpoint, composition, and score reading. She was weekly taken to concerts, but he also made sure she had time for long walks in the fresh air. I could use some of those. She was also prepped in languages in prep for tours to France and England, but otherwise her general education was quite meager. Friedrich did not have her learning any of the feminine things, and in fact, all of his pupils were advised against sewing, knitting, and crocheting. Friedrich had Clara copy out letters that he had written to colleagues and business associates, and this was actually to help her learn and absorb sort of the business side of things. But Friedrich was very controlling. Her diary was used to educate her and maybe communicate some general information, some praise, or of course, condemnation. She was never really the person to write in her diary. The entries are written in first person, but it was her father who wrote most everything. And then when she did write, she was supervised. Scattered throughout her journals, we see like emendations by Friedrich and maybe some comments in the margins. Not until Clara was 19 years old was she able to freely write in her own journal. Her brothers did not receive the same education as Clara. They were actually quite neglected, and Friedrich treated them deplorably. Robert Schumann once wrote in his diary that he saw Friedrich abusing Alvin after he didn't play very well. And he writes that Alvin is just begging for his father to give him back his violin. He really wanted to play. And Robert Schumann writes, "Am I even among human beings?" So speaking of Robert, the Wiecks met Robert Schumann in 1828. At the time, Clara was 9 and Robert was 18. After hearing Clara play, Robert was so impressed that he began studying with Friedrich. And then in 1830, he moved in as a boarder, which was quite common. Early on, though Robert felt early on. So sorry, Robert did feel great ambivalence about Friedrich. Like he got kind of an idea about him right from the get-go. He had very grave concerns about Friedrich's sincerity of his attachment to Clara. He was convinced that Friedrich cared more about Clara's earning power than about Clara herself. And yeah, he was right. After a year with boarding with the Weeks, Robert left, but he and Clara still managed to see each other daily. And over the following years, this friendship buds into a romance. To say that Friedrich was not so keen on this is okay. This is a great quote. It's just perfect. To say that Friedrich, whose temper was never good, opposed this is a considerable understatement. So while Friedrich and Clara were on that Vienna tour I was talking about before, he refused to let Clara and Robert correspond. And in fact, they actually had some friends help them covertly send letters to one another. And they had like people that would bring stuff in so it didn't come in the post, and then Friedrich couldn't see it and stop it. But at age 18, Clara had firmly declared her love for Robert. And Friedrich actually threatened to disinherit her if she married him. And this even included the money that Clara had made herself, which actually later they had to sue for to get back. And if we wanted to give Friedrich the benefit of the doubt, which we won't, but you might say that his issue was with Robert because, he's a musician and how is he going to support Clara? But the real issue was that he didn't want to lose control over Clara's career and her income. So it seems then that for Clara, if she wants to marry Robert, she is going to have to break with her father. And this is actually a very complex thing for her, because even though, of course, we know he is not a good man, he's quite terrible and psychologically abusive to her anyway. She still loves him. He's still her father. And she feels so indebted to him because he is why she can play piano, and she loves piano. She loves music. And so this gave her a lot of extreme anguish. In 1839, Friedrich, who was furious with Clara's attachment to Robert, sends her to Paris alone with a French woman named Mademoiselle Claudine Dufour. She was a stranger, and so she was to be Clara's chaperone. He was hoping that this trip would discourage Clara. It would be very just like a colossal defeat. And then she would give up and she would return home and he would get to continue to have his control. But it did not go that way. So to even Clara's own astonishment, she persevered and she met new friends. She eventually dismissed this chaperone and she arranged some of her own successful concerts. She realized that she already knew how to carry on a career without her father. He had taught her so well. While she was in Paris, she learned practicality, self-confidence, and she discovered she had her own hard-headed stubbornness that she naturally inherited from Friedrich. While she's in Paris, this is really cool. She meets Alexander Dumas and Hector Berlioz. And this little tidbit here, it's just so perfect because it just fits the dramaticism of Hector Berlioz. So he had given Clara kind of an unsavory review of one of her concerts, and she did not quite like this. And so then in a letter to Robert, she called Berlioz her secret enemy. So even though Paris didn't give her this great reputation and career catapult that she was hoping for, it taught her so much about herself as a woman. So it then became clear that Friedrich was not going to consent to their being married. So Clara and Robert actually had to appeal to the courts to get the permission to marry. So they were able to do so, of course. And in 1840, oh, that is a typo, 1840, they got married. And this is not happily ever after. For those of you who are aware of Robert Schumann's history, he has mental health problems. And he attempted suicide and was admitted into a hospital about 14 years later. And this is heartbreaking. The doctor was advising that Clara not visit Robert for his own health. And so she got to see him 2 days before he died. But Clara she's a resilient and amazing woman. in all of this, like, so when she's married with Robert, and afterwards, she still gives concerts. She takes care of the kids. She had 7 children, and eventually she also took into her care 6 grandchildren. So with this, to provide for everyone, she is teaching and she is touring. She's managing the house. She constantly promoted Robert's music too. She just kind of, once he died, she stopped composing in it, and her work was sort of all about promoting Robert's music. Anyway, but she is amazing, what she's able to do in the end. Anyway, we have like time for questions. I'm making sure that there is time for questions. So with that, okay, are there any questions? Okay, is Fanny's song about death or desertion? Are we talking about Varum, the one I can't pronounce? That's not Fondra. Let's see. I actually don't know. I'd have to read into the poetry, and to be completely fair, I am a complete dunce when it comes to poetry. Yeah. Sorry, I can't give a good answer for that. Yeah, the first song. Yeah. Yeah, I am such a dunce with poetry. But the poem, ooh, let's just grab my book here, is by, the poem is by, oh, that's not right. Here we go, Heinrich Heine. So feel free to look into that. So sorry. Any other questions that I can attempt to answer? What was the piece for each month by Fanny? That is called Das Jahr. So it's spelled DASJAHR, and it means the year. I knew this was gonna happen. All right, question. Clara was a good friend of Brahms. How does she influence his music compositions? Ooh, that actually, okay, my thought was it was gonna be just about Brahms. My understanding is that they sort of had a very mutual, like a mutual friendship, sort of like Fanny had with Felix, where they were sending each other scores and getting critiques and like feedback from one another. To be fair, I read the chapter in the biography on Clara and Brahms after I had been reading for about 5 hours. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't have an answer to that, but that is a great dissertation question. Oh, yeah, that was a great dissertation question. Can you talk about Clara's liter output? Yes. So Clara didn't have as much of a liter output as, say, Fanny did. I forget how many, but I think it's like in the 2-digit numbers. One of the first collections that she would have published was actually in co-authorship with Robert. And actually, it's an interesting reason for that too. There was one author that was saying, even with Fanny, because Felix published some of her pieces under his name, that they would do this when they weren't quite sure how the public would respond to their music. So then if it was mixed in with someone else, they couldn't necessarily just be put down for their gender. Yeah, but yeah, she didn't use it as often. Most of her stuff was mostly for like things that included piano. So piano pieces, piano concerti, trios. Ooh, and my favorite Clara piece, it is in the playlist, is the piano trio. Oh, so good. So good. Which biographies do you recommend on Clara, Robert, Fanny? Okay, so in my small city, we have a very small collection. I'm just going to grab the book. Um, there we go. So the biography on Clara Schumann that the Saskatoon Public Library has is by Nancy B. Reich, and she is actually considered one of the like kind of first scholars on her. This was written in 1985. I would definitely suggest this one right here. It might have a newer cover if you are in a bigger city, because they'd have a newer edition. But yeah, the 1985 by Nancy B. Reich for Clara Schumann. I don't actually have anything on Robert, but like that is something I would love to dig into one day, is looking into like Clara and Robert both. And the one that I had for Fanny was by Francois Tilliard, and again, looks like this. This is Saskatoon Public Library there, but there's lots in them. Okay, there's a question in the chat I'm supposed to find here. In the list of composers Clara premiered, did you say Chopin? Yes, I did say Chopin. Yes, I did. Do you believe the rumors that some of Fanny's works may have been published under Felix's name? Yes. Here's a great story. I didn't have time for it. I'm going to tell it now. So there was Felix was playing a concert in Buckingham Palace in 1842 of all of his works. And he's playing them. And when it's done, Queen Victoria, she comes up and she says, "Oh, the Italian. Oh, that was my favorite." And so Felix had to confess that that was not his piece. It was in fact Fanny's. But yeah, no, that did happen. Next question. Who was the scholar that enumerated the conditions necessary for composition that you alluded to this week last? Ooh, good thing all of my notes are really confusing. I believe that was from Convent to Concert Hall. Oh yeah, so that book, the one I'm pretty sure that's from, is from this book here. It's called From Convent to Concert Hall. There's Sylvia Glickman. And yeah, I don't know precisely who that is, but I'm like 80% confident that it was from this book. And this book was edited by Sylvia Glickman and Martha Furman Schleifer. So that's From Convent to Concert Hall. I should seriously, okay, I'm going to do that like this weekend on my blog, on my website, kendraharder.com. I am going to list all of the resources that I have been using. Did other pianists play Clara's music in major concerts during her life? Ooh, not sure. I think privately for sure, because she would have published and sold things. But actually, I don't know about that. It was kind of the standard that you played your own music, but that changed though. That did change. All right. Any other questions? Ooh, in the chat, there are some other good biographies that are mentioned. There's R. Larry Todd's bio of Fanny, and that is referenced in actually a lot of the books that I was talking about. All right. Well, it looks like the Q&A has dried up. Oh, nope, JK. Did they have any contemporaries who decided to forego marriage so as to continue their musical career? I don't know about foregoing necessarily, but maybe just not. Okay. The people I know of right off the top of my head, and this one would have been a contemporary because she would have died a few years before they were. Oh no, she would have. Well, her lifetime was before they were born. But Mariana Martinez, she never married, and actually Ethel Smythe, or Smith, changing my pronunciation. Ethel Smith also never married. So she's born like 1860s. I don't remember. But yeah, but usually though what happened was if you yeah, never mind. You understand. Okay. Is there a full anthology of Fanny's Leader? I believe that is a big no, unfortunately. A lot of her stuff remained unpublished. Um, so most of what we have is what's been published. And there's a lot of things actually that are like they're in libraries and they need to be like brought out and like borrowed and taken down and into modern notation. And I know that there's some that are in people's personal libraries that are off limits. And to those people, I want to say, make it public. So unfortunately, not yet, but hopefully one day. Da, 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 Any other questions? All right. Well, this has been, oh, yes. Follow up. Are there any markers to distinguish Fanny's music published under Felix's name? I think those pieces have already been discovered and then republished under her name, like nowadays. I think that's where that goes. I don't know if there was a lot published under Felix's name, but like there were definitely a few, and I'm 89% confident that those have been, yeah, discovered. Many couples at the time who both composed and performed. That would require, again, that's a good question. I don't know if there were many couples, because again, like Clara is so unique. Like her education is so unique. The fact that she did marry Robert, yeah, there very well could be. I don't know of them, and I'm not an expert. Let's be honest here. Yeah, it's a very unique situation that made Clara and Robert. That would take a lot of awesome research, though. Good question. Da, 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 da. Doing the awkward song while we see if there's any other questions. Da, da, da. Okay, I'm gonna stop my awkward song and dance there. Thank you all so much for tuning in and for being great listeners and engaging with questions. This has been awesome. Yeah, thank you all very much. And we will see you next week. And yeah, I will do my very best to make a list of all of the resources that I've been using. And I'll try to get that on my blog, on my webpage, and then I'll share it on my Facebook and Twitter. All right. Oh, thank you, Ria. Cool. All right, guys, you have a great night. And adios.